Hi, I'm Zara, and for 23 years my own family treated me like a walking reminder of their shame. They flinched when I wore short sleeves, changed the subject when strangers stared, and made cruel jokes about my appearance when they thought I couldn't hear. The burn scars that covered my left arm and shoulder weren't just marks on my skin, they were invisible chains that kept me small, quiet, and apologetic for existing. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But last month, when I stepped onto that stage at the Millbrook Healthcare Innovation Awards as the youngest keynote speaker in the event's history, their laughter died in their throats. Because sometimes the very thing people mock you for becomes the catalyst that changes everything. The burn scars have been with me for as long as I can remember forming coherent thoughts. I was 7 when our house on Pine Ridge Avenue caught fire during one of Colorado's notorious dry summers. The details are fuzzy, filtered through the haze of childhood trauma and years of trying to forget. But I remember the smell of smoke creeping under my bedroom door. The way the hallway filled with an orange glow that should have been beautiful but felt terrifying instead. My parents, Gordon and Diane, managed to get my older brother Caleb and younger sister Ivy out first. By the time they came back for me, the flames had already claimed half the upstairs, and a burning beam had fallen across my left side as I tried to crawl toward the window. The physical healing took months. Skin grafts, physical therapy, bandages that needed changing daily while I bit down on a washcloth to keep from screaming. But the emotional wounds never quite closed, especially not with the way my family handled the aftermath. Instead of rallying around me, instead of helping me process what had happened, they seemed to collectively decide that my scars were an inconvenience they'd rather not acknowledge. Diane would buy me long-sleeved shirts even in the middle of summer, claiming they looked more put together than tank tops. Gordon would suddenly find something fascinating to stare at whenever I raised my left arm too high and the scarred skin became visible. Caleb, 3 years older and already developing the casual cruelty that runs in teenage boys, started calling me crispy when our parents weren't around. Ivy, barely 5 at the time, learned to mimic their discomfort without understanding why, unconsciously shifting away from me whenever I sat too close. The worst part wasn't the stares from strangers, or the questions from classmates who'd never learned proper boundaries. It was the way my own family made me feel like I needed to apologize for surviving. Every time I forgot to cover up, every time I reached for something on a high shelf and my sleeve rode up, every time I dared to wear something that made me feel remotely attractive, there would be that moment of silent judgment. That quick exchange of glances between my parents, the way Caleb would smirk and shake his head, the way conversations would shift just slightly to remind me that I was different, damaged, something to be managed rather than celebrated. School wasn't much better, but at least there I could hide behind academic achievement. I threw myself into science classes with a desperate hunger that surprised my teacher. Chemistry became my sanctuary, a world where reactions were predictable, where cause and effect followed logical patterns, where the external appearance of compounds meant nothing compared to their molecular structure. I spent lunch periods in the lab, stayed after school for extra credit projects, and built a reputation as the quiet girl who could solve any equation but rarely spoke up in class. The guidance counselor, Miss Patterson, tried to encourage me to join clubs, make friends, participate in social activities, but how could I explain that every group setting felt like stepping into a courtroom where I was perpetually on trial for crimes I didn't commit? How could I tell her that even at home, even with people who were supposed to love me unconditionally, I felt like an unwelcome guest overstaying my welcome? High school graduation came and went in a blur of academic honors and scholarship announcements. I'd been accepted to the University of Colorado Boulder with a full ride for biochemistry, something that should have been a celebration for any family. Instead, dinner that night felt strained, punctuated by my father's complaints about property taxes and my mother's worry about me living so far from home. Not worry born from love or concern for my well-being, but the kind of nervous energy that comes from losing control over something you've been managing. "You sure you're ready for this?" Gordon asked, cutting his steak with more force than necessary. "College kids can be pretty judgmental. Not everyone's going to be as understanding as we've been." Understanding? The word sat heavy in my chest like a stone I couldn't cough up. Understanding of what? Exactly. Understanding of their years of subtle messages that I was something to be hidden. Understanding of birthday parties where they strategically seated me away from family photos. Understanding of beach vacations where I was expected to stay fully covered while Ivy ran around in bikinis. I think I'll manage, I said quietly, pushing mashed potatoes around my plate. The scars on my arm pulled slightly as I moved, a sensation I'd grown so accustomed to that I barely noticed it anymore. But Caleb noticed. He always noticed. Just don't expect special treatment, because he gestured vaguely in my direction, the universal family shorthand for acknowledging my scars without actually saying the words. College professors don't care about sob stories. Diane shot him a warning look, but it was the kind of performative disapproval parents deploy when they don't really disagree with the sentiment, just the delivery. Caleb, she said mildly, the way you might scold a child for using the wrong form. I'm not looking for special treatment, I replied, meeting his eyes directly for the first time in months. I've never asked for special treatment. Good, Gordon said, apparently considering this a reasonable conclusion to the conversation. Independence builds character. I wanted to laugh at the irony. Independence, as if I hadn't been independent by necessity since I was 7 years old. Learning to change my own bandages because watching me flinch made Diane uncomfortable. As if I hadn't been emotionally self-sufficient for years because every attempt to share my feelings was met with suggestions to focus on the positive, or reminders that things could be worse. After dinner I retreated to my room and stared at the acceptance letter I'd pinned to my bulletin board. The University of Colorado Boulder, a chance to reinvent myself, to exist in a space where my history wasn't written across my skin for everyone to read. For the first time in weeks I felt something that might have been hope. The summer before college passed in a strange suspension of time. I worked at the Summit Cafe downtown, a job I'd chosen specifically because the uniform included long sleeves and because the owner, a kind woman named Rosa, had hired me based on my references rather than an in-person interview. The work was simple but satisfying. Making coffee, taking orders, wiping down tables. There was something comforting about the routine, the way each day had a clear beginning and end. My coworkers were mostly other high school graduates killing time before college or careers, and for a few precious hours each day, I could almost pretend I was normal. I became friends with a girl named Priya Nakamura, whose family had moved to Millbrook the previous year when her father took a job at the nearby medical research facility. Priya had the kind of effortless confidence I envied, the ability to walk into any room and belong there simply by virtue of believing she deserved to. She was the first person outside my family to see my scars, and it happened entirely by accident. We were closing up the cafe one particularly hot evening in July, and I'd rolled up my sleeves without thinking while scrubbing down the espresso machine. When I turned around, Priya was staring, but not with the mixture of pity and revulsion I'd grown accustomed to. Her expression was curious, almost clinical. That must have hurt like hell, she said simply. I froze, waiting for the inevitable follow-up questions, the awkward sympathy, the careful redirection of attention to anything else. Instead, Priya shrugged and went back to counting the register. House fire when I was 7. I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. My cousin has similar scars from a car accident, she replied matter-of-factly. Took him months to stop covering them up all the time. Now he says they're conversation starters at parties. I laughed despite myself, a sound that surprised us both. Conversation starters. I never thought of them that way. Everything's a choice, right? You can let them define you, or you can define them. She paused, looking up from the cash drawer. Though I guess that's easier said than done when you're dealing with family stuff. I must have made some expression because she continued. My parents used to freak out about my birthmark. She pushed up her hair to reveal a port wine stain that covered part of her neck and jaw. Spent thousands on laser treatments when I was younger. Took me years to realize the problem wasn't my face. It was their discomfort with it. That night, I lay awake thinking about choices and definitions, about the difference between being marked by something and being defined by it. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine a future where my scars were simply part of my story rather than the entire narrative. College applications had asked for personal essays, and I'd written a safe, generic piece about overcoming challenges and discovering my passion for science. But as August approached and my departure date loomed closer, I found myself wondering what I might have written instead. What would it have looked like to tell the truth about growing up in a family that treated love like a finite resource, carefully rationed and conditionally distributed? What would it have meant to write about learning to become whole in a house full of people who saw me as fundamentally broken? The night before I left for Boulder, my family gathered in the living room for what Diane called a farewell celebration. She'd made a cake, chocolate with vanilla frosting, the same kind she made for every birthday and special occasion. It sat in the center of the coffee table like a peace offering, surrounded by carefully wrapped gifts that felt more like obligations than gestures of love. Caleb gave me a gift card to a clothing store, with the helpful suggestion that I find some styles that work for you. Ivy, now 12 and developing her own complicated relationship with our family dynamics, had picked out a decorative picture frame. Gordon and Diane presented me with a care package filled with snacks, toiletries, and a first aid kit that felt grimly appropriate. "We're proud of you," Diane said, though her voice carried the same careful modulation she used when complimenting strangers. "You've worked very hard." I wanted to ask what, specifically, they were proud of. My grades, my scholarships, my ability to exist quietly in their periphery for 18 years without causing too much disruption. Instead, I smiled and thanked them, playing my part in the familiar choreography of our family interaction. Later that evening, as I finished packing the last of my belongings, I found myself standing in front of my bedroom mirror. The scars were visible in my reflection, raised lines of skin that caught the light differently than the surrounding tissue. For years I'd avoided looking directly at them, training my eyes to skip over that part of my body like reading around a redacted document. But that night, I forced myself to really see them. They were part of me, had been part of me longer than they had. They told a story of survival, of a 7-year-old girl who'd crawled through smoke and flame and lived to tell about it. They were proof that I was stronger than the people who'd spent years convincing me I was fragile. I pulled on a sleeveless shirt and stood there for a long moment, watching myself in the mirror. Tomorrow I would drive to Boulder and begin the next chapter of my life. Tonight, for the first time in 11 years, I was going to stop apologizing for taking up space. The morning of my departure dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect Colorado sky that makes you believe anything is possible. I loaded my car with methodical precision, checking and double-checking that I had everything I needed. My family gathered on the front porch to see me off, a tableau that might have looked heartwarming to any neighbors who happened to be watching. "Drive carefully," Diane said, adjusting my rearview mirror as if I hadn't been driving for 2 years already, "and call when you get there." Gordon shook my hand with the same formal politeness he might show a business acquaintance. Caleb offered a brief, awkward hug that felt more like a diplomatic gesture than an expression of affection. Ivy surprised me by tearing up a little, though she quickly wiped her eyes and stepped back. "Don't forget about us," she said, and for a moment, she sounded like the little girl who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. "I won't," I promised, though part of me wondered if forgetting might not be the healthiest option. As I pulled out of the driveway, I caught sight of them in my rearview mirror, 3 figures standing stiffly on the porch, already turning to go back inside before my car had even reached the end of our street. The image felt symbolic somehow, a perfect encapsulation of our family dynamic, always eager to return to the comfort of familiar routines, always ready to close the door on anything that might disrupt their carefully maintained equilibrium. The drive to Boulder took just over an hour, but it felt like crossing into another world. The city was larger than Millbrook, more diverse, full of young people carrying backpacks and coffee cups, and expressions of determined optimism. The university campus sprawled across several city blocks, a mix of historic brick buildings and modern glass structures that caught the morning light, like promises. My dorm room was small but clean, with 2 beds, 2 desks, and a window that looked out over a courtyard where students were already gathering in small groups. My roommate, a cheerful girl named Amanda from Denver, helped me carry boxes upstairs, and chattered enthusiastically about class schedules and meal plans, and weekend activities. She was the kind of person who radiated uncomplicated happiness, and I found myself both envious of and grateful for her easy warmth. "Are you nervous?" she asked, as we arranged furniture and unpacked clothes. "A little," I admitted, hanging shirts in my half of the shared closet. Most of them were long-sleeved, old habits dying hard. I'm terrified, she said with a laugh, but also excited, like scared excited. You know what I mean? I did know what she meant. Standing in that dorm room, surrounded by the detritus of my old life, and the blank slate of my new one, I felt the same mixture of terror and anticipation. For the first time in years I had no idea what came next, and the uncertainty was both thrilling and paralyzing. That first semester passed in a blur of lectures and lab reports, study groups and dining hall meals. I threw myself into my coursework with the same intensity I'd brought to high school, but with a crucial difference here. Excellence felt like a choice rather than a survival strategy. My professors were challenging but encouraging, pushing me to think beyond memorization and toward genuine understanding. I particularly loved my organic chemistry class, taught by Vincent Torres, a soft-spoken man in his 50s, who had a gift for making complex molecular structures feel like puzzles waiting to be solved. He noticed my enthusiasm early on and began suggesting additional reading, inviting me to attend guest lectures, encouraging me to consider research opportunities. You have an intuitive understanding of chemical relationships, he told me one afternoon after class. Have you thought about graduate school? Graduate school? The idea hadn't occurred to me, though it should have. I'd been so focused on simply getting through college that I hadn't considered what might come after. I'm not sure, I said honestly. I love the work, but I don't know if I'm cut out for academia. Dr. Torres studied me with the same careful attention he brought to his research. What makes you think that? I struggled to articulate the feeling that I was somehow playing dress-up in a world where I didn't quite belong. How could I explain that growing up in a family that treated my very existence as an inconvenience had left me with a fundamental uncertainty about my right to take up space? I guess I've never thought of myself as the type of person who gets to want things, I said finally. He said, nodding as if this explained everything. Well, that's the first thing we'll need to work on. Over the following months, Dr. Torres became more than just a professor. He was a mentor in the truest sense, someone who saw potential I couldn't see in myself, and refused to let me settle for less than what I was capable of achieving. He introduced me to graduate students in his lab, helped me apply for undergraduate research positions, and gradually began including me in conversations about cutting-edge developments in biochemical research. It was through his lab that I first learned about bioengineered skin grafts, a field that was revolutionizing treatment for burn victims. The research was fascinating from a purely scientific perspective, but it felt personal in a way that caught me off guard. Here were brilliant minds working to solve problems I understood intimately, developing solutions that might spare other children from years of self-consciousness and shame. I started spending more and more time in the lab, arriving early and staying late, losing myself in the methodical precision of experimental design. There was something deeply satisfying about the work, the way hypotheses could be tested and refined, the way failure was simply data pointing toward better questions. My family called occasionally, dutiful check-ins that felt more like obligations than expressions of genuine interest. The conversations followed a predictable pattern: questions about my grades, reminders to eat well and get enough sleep, updates about life in Millbrook that made my hometown feel increasingly small and distant. How are your classes going? Diane would ask. Really well. I'm doing some research with one of my professors. That's nice, honey. Make sure you're not overworking yourself. Never curiosity about what kind of research, never questions about what I was learning or discovering. It was as if they'd filed me away in a category labeled daughter, college, satisfactory progress, and couldn't be bothered to look deeper. The disconnect became even more apparent during my first visit home for Thanksgiving. I'd been excited to share some of my experiences, to tell them about the lab work and the papers I'd been reading, and the possibilities that felt increasingly real. Instead, I found myself sitting at the same dining room table, eating the same overcooked turkey, listening to the same complaints and gossip that had dominated our family conversations for years. When I tried to explain my research, Caleb interrupted with a joke about me playing with test tubes, and the conversation quickly shifted to his job at the local hardware store and Ivy's middle school drama. I realized with a sharp clarity that hurt more than I'd expected that they simply weren't interested in who I was becoming. They preferred the version of me they'd always known: quiet, grateful, undemanding. That night, lying in my childhood bed, surrounded by posters and books that felt like artifacts from someone else's life, I made a decision. I would stop trying to bridge the gap between my old self and my new one. I would stop waiting for my family to show interest in my growth, to celebrate my achievements, to see me as anything more than the damaged girl they'd learned to manage. I would save my energy for people who actually wanted to know me. The decision felt both liberating and heartbreaking, like choosing to amputate a limb that had never quite healed properly, but it also felt necessary, a recognition that some relationships are too toxic to sustain, even when they're wrapped in the language of family loyalty. When I returned to Boulder after that Thanksgiving break, I threw myself into my research with renewed focus. Dr. Torres had offered me a position as an undergraduate research assistant, a role that came with its own small stipend and, more importantly, the opportunity to contribute to groundbreaking work in tissue engineering. The project I was assigned to involved developing new scaffolding materials for skin regeneration, work that required long hours in the lab, and careful documentation of every variable and outcome. It was meticulous, sometimes tedious work, but I found it deeply fulfilling in a way that surprised me. There was something profoundly meaningful about contributing to research that might help other burn survivors, about turning my own experience into something that could benefit others. As winter melted into spring and my sophomore year drew to a close, I found myself thinking less and less about Millbrook and the family I'd left behind. Boulder had become home in a way that Pine Ridge Avenue never had, a place where I could exist without constantly defending my right to be there. I was building something here, something entirely my own, and for the first time in my life, that felt like enough. Junior year arrived with an unexpected opportunity that would reshape everything I thought I knew about my capabilities. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Torres approached me during one of our regular lab meetings, his expression carrying the kind of quiet excitement that meant something significant was brewing. "There's a conference coming up," he said, settling into the chair across from my lab bench. "The International Symposium on Regenerative Medicine in Denver. I've been invited to present our preliminary findings on the scaffold project." I nodded, assuming he was simply sharing good news about his own career advancement. The research we'd been conducting had shown promising results, and recognition from the broader scientific community felt well-deserved. "I'd like you to co-present with me," he continued, and my hands stilled on the pipette I'd been adjusting. "Co-present?" The words felt foreign in my mouth. "You mean, like stand up there and talk to actual scientists?" Dr. Torres smiled at my obvious panic. "Actual scientists who are very interested in our work. Yes. You've contributed significantly to this research, Zara. You deserve recognition for that." The idea terrified me in ways I couldn't fully articulate. Standing in front of a room full of experts, talking about work I'd poured my heart into, seemed simultaneously thrilling and impossible. What if I stumbled over my words? What if someone asked a question I couldn't answer? What if they looked at me and saw what my family had always seen? Someone damaged. Someone who didn't quite belong. "I don't know if I'm ready for something like that," I said quietly. "Nobody ever feels ready," Dr. Torres replied. "But readiness isn't a prerequisite for growth. Sometimes you have to leap before you're certain you can fly." That night, I called Priya, who had become my closest friend despite the distance between Boulder and Millbrook. She'd started college at Colorado State, pursuing environmental engineering, and our friendship had deepened through late-night phone calls and weekend visits. "Are you insane?" she said when I told her about the conference invitation. "This is incredible. Do you know how many grad students would kill for an opportunity like this? But what if I mess it up? What if I get up there and freeze? Then you'll unfreeze and keep going," she said matter-of-factly. "Besides, you know this research better than anyone except Dr. Torres himself. You've lived and breathed it for months." She was right, of course. I did know the research intimately. I understood every aspect of our methodology, could recite our findings in my sleep, and had contributed ideas that had genuinely improved our approach. But knowledge and confidence were different things entirely. "My family thinks I'm just playing with test tubes," I said, voicing a fear I hadn't fully acknowledged until that moment. Your family thinks a lot of stupid things, Priya replied bluntly. That doesn't make them true. Over the following weeks, Dr. Torres and I worked together to prepare our presentation. He was patient with my nervousness, helping me practice until the words felt natural, until I could discuss our findings with something approaching confidence. Slowly, I began to understand that this wasn't just about presenting research. It was about claiming my place in a community of people who shared my passion for discovery. The conference was held at a massive hotel in downtown Denver, the kind of place with marble floors and crystal chandeliers that made me feel simultaneously sophisticated and out of place. Scientists from around the world had gathered to share their latest breakthroughs, and the energy in the air was electric with possibility. Our presentation was scheduled for the second day, in a conference room that seated approximately 200 people. As I stood at the podium, looking out at faces I didn't recognize but who represented everything I aspired to become, something shifted inside me. These people weren't here to judge my appearance or question my right to exist in this space. They were here because they cared about the same things I cared about: healing, discovery, the possibility of reducing suffering through scientific innovation. I began to speak, and the words flowed more naturally than I'd dared to hope. I talked about our scaffold design, about the cellular response we'd observed, about the implications for future treatment protocols. I fielded questions with growing confidence, drawing on months of careful observation and analysis. When it was over, the applause felt different from any recognition I'd received before. It wasn't polite or obligatory, it was genuine appreciation for work that mattered. Dr. Torres squeezed my shoulder as we left the stage, his pride unmistakable. That, he said, was the performance of someone who belongs exactly where she is. The rest of the conference passed in a blur of conversations with researchers from prestigious institutions, business cards exchanged, and invitations to collaborate. I found myself talking to people who treated me as a colleague rather than a student, who were interested in my ideas and perspective. It was intoxicating in a way I hadn't expected. On the final evening, there was a reception in the hotel's ballroom. I'd brought one dress that I thought was appropriate, a simple black sheath with three-quarter sleeves that covered my scars while still looking professional. As I mingled with other attendees, sipping wine and discussing research applications, I caught sight of myself in one of the ballroom's massive mirrors. The person looking back at me was confident, engaged, animated by genuine passion for her work. Her scars were hidden, yes, but not out of shame, simply because this was how she chose to present herself in this particular moment. For the first time, I saw myself the way Dr. Torres had been seeing me all along: as a scientist, a researcher, a person with something valuable to contribute. That night, alone in my hotel room, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. I was going to apply for graduate school, not because I thought I should, but because I wanted to. I wanted to continue this research, to push the boundaries of what was possible, to spend my life working on problems that mattered. The next morning, I drove back to Boulder with a sense of purpose I'd never experienced before. The mountains looked different somehow, more welcoming, as if the landscape itself was acknowledging my transformation. I had work to do, applications to complete, a future to build. When I called my family that evening to share the news about the conference, their response was exactly what I'd expected, and somehow still disappointing. "That sounds nice, honey," Diane said, her tone suggesting she was only half listening. "I'm sure it was a good learning experience." "It wasn't just a learning experience," I said, trying to inject some enthusiasm into my voice. "I co-presented research that could change how we treat burn victims. There were researchers there from Harvard, from Johns Hopkins, from—" "Well, don't let it go to your head," Gordon interrupted. "College is full of big ideas that don't amount to much in the real world." The real world. As if the work I was doing, the problems I was trying to solve, the lives I hoped to improve, weren't real enough to matter. As if my passion and dedication were just phases to be outgrown rather than the foundation of a meaningful career. "I'm applying to graduate school," I said, the words coming out more forcefully than I'd intended. There was a pause, the kind of loaded silence that had characterized so many of our family conversations over the years. "Graduate school is expensive," Diane said, finally, "and it's a lot more years of studying instead of working. I'll get funding, research assistantships, fellowships. Dr. Torres thinks I have a strong chance." "Dr. Torres isn't the one who'll be paying your bills if it doesn't work out," Gordon said. "No," I replied, my voice steady despite the anger building in my chest. "I'll be paying my own bills, just like I have." The conversation ended shortly after that, with the usual promises to talk soon that we all knew were perfunctory. I hung up the phone and sat in the quiet of my dorm room, processing the familiar sting of their indifference. But this time, something was different. Their dismissal didn't crush me the way it once had. Instead, it clarified something I'd been struggling to understand for months: their inability to see my potential, to celebrate my achievements, to support my dreams. That was about them, not about me. Their limitations weren't my limitation. I opened my laptop and began working on my graduate school applications, with a focus I'd never brought to anything before. Personal statements, research proposals, transcripts, and recommendation letters. Each component felt like a piece of a bridge I was building toward the person I wanted to become. Torres was invaluable during this process, helping me identify programs that would be the best fit for my interests and abilities. We spent hours discussing research opportunities, faculty members, and the different directions my career might take. "Have you thought about what specific area you want to focus on?" he asked during one of our planning sessions. "Burn treatment," I said without hesitation. "I want to develop better therapies for severe burn victims, especially children." He nodded thoughtfully. "Personal motivation can be powerful in research, but you'll need to be prepared for the emotional challenges that come with that kind of work." I understood what he meant. Working in a field that was intimately connected to my own trauma would require a level of emotional resilience I wasn't sure I possessed, but it also felt like the most authentic path forward, a way to transform my experience into something that could benefit others. "I think I can handle it," I said. "I think I need to handle it." The application process took months, and waiting for responses felt like existing in a state of suspended animation. I threw myself into my coursework and research with renewed intensity, partly as a distraction, and partly as preparation for whatever came next. Spring brought acceptance letters from several prestigious programs, each offering funding packages that would allow me to pursue my doctorate without financial stress. The moment I opened the first acceptance email, I felt a rush of validation that was almost overwhelming. These institutions, places I'd only dreamed of attending, wanted me. They believed in my potential, in my ability to contribute to their research community. I celebrated that night with Priya and a few other friends, sharing pizza and cheap champagne in my dorm room while we talked about our post-graduation plan. It felt surreal to be making decisions about my future based on multiple attractive options, rather than scrambling for any opportunity at all. "I'm proud of you," Priya said, as the evening wound down. "You've worked so hard for this." "I still can't quite believe it's real," I admitted. "Believe it," she said firmly. "You earned every bit of this." When I called my family to share the news, I tried to approach the conversation with realistic expectations. I knew they wouldn't match my enthusiasm, but I hoped for at least basic acknowledgement of what I'd accomplished. "Graduate school," Diane repeated when I told her about the acceptances. "How many more years is that?" 4 to 6, typically, but I'll be getting paid to do research, so it's more like a job than traditional school. 6 years, Gordon said, and I could hear the disapproval in his voice. "That's a long time to be a student. Most people your age are starting careers, getting married, having families." The implication was clear: I was choosing an extended adolescence over real adult responsibility. Never mind that graduate school was a career path, that the research I'd be conducting could have real-world applications, that I'd be earning a living while pursuing my education. "This is my career," I said quietly. "This is what I want to do with my life." "Well," Diane said in the tone she used when she disagreed, but didn't want to argue, "I suppose you know what's best for you." The conversation left me feeling deflated despite the magnitude of what I'd achieved. I'd earned acceptance to top-tier programs, secured full funding, and positioned myself to pursue research that could make a genuine difference in the world. Yet my family's response made it feel like a frivolous indulgence rather than a significant accomplishment. That night, I sat in my room, looking through the acceptance letters and program descriptions, trying to recapture the excitement I'd felt earlier. Slowly, I began to understand that their inability to recognize my success wasn't a reflection of my worth. It was a reflection of their limitation. I thought about the conference presentation, about the researchers who had approached me afterward with genuine interest in my work. I thought about Dr. Torres, who had invested time and energy in my development, because he saw something worth nurturing. I thought about Priya and my other friends, who celebrated my achievements without reservation. These people, my chosen community, understood what I was building. They recognized the value of my work, the significance of my goals, the legitimacy of my aspiration. Their opinions mattered more than the reflexive negativity of people who had never bothered to truly know me. I made my decision that night, choosing a program at the University of Colorado, Denver that would allow me to continue working with cutting-edge research, while staying relatively close to the network I'd built. It felt like the right balance between growth and stability, challenge and support. The summer before graduate school began, I took a research internship at the National Institute of Standards and Technology in Boulder. The work was challenging and rewarding, involving the development of new materials for medical applications. My supervisor, Dr. Zara Chen, was a brilliant scientist who pushed me to think beyond conventional approaches to problem solving. Innovation comes from questioning assumptions, she told me during one of our weekly meetings. The moment you accept that something is impossible, you stop looking for solutions. It was advice that resonated on multiple levels. For years I'd accepted my family's assumptions about my limitations, their subtle messages that I should be grateful for whatever small recognition I received, rather than striving for something greater. But those assumptions were just that, assumptions, not facts. I started to question other beliefs I'd internalized without examination. The idea that my scars made me less attractive, less valuable, less worthy of love and respect. The notion that I should hide parts of myself to make others more comfortable. The assumption that my worth was determined by other people's opinions, rather than my own actions and choices. One particularly hot afternoon in late July, I was working alone in the lab, when I realized I'd unconsciously rolled up my sleeves while handling some equipment. My scars were fully visible, and for the first time in years I didn't immediately cover them. I stood there for a moment, looking down at the raised lines of tissue that had been part of me for most of my life. They weren't beautiful in any conventional sense, but they weren't shameful either. They were simply part of my story, evidence of survival and resilience. They represented a night when everything changed, but also a lifetime of adaptation and growth that followed. Dr. Chen walked into the lab just then, and I braced myself for the familiar moment of awkwardness that usually accompanied people seeing my scars for the first time. Instead, she glanced at my arm briefly and then looked directly at my face. "How's the sample preparation going?" she asked, as if nothing about my appearance was worthy of comment. It was such a simple interaction, but it felt revolutionary. Here was a person who saw my scars and immediately looked past them to focus on what I was doing, what I was capable of, what I was contributing. It was a glimpse of how the world could be if I stopped leading every interaction with apology and shame. That evening, I called Priya and told her about the moment in the lab. "It sounds like you're finally starting to see yourself the way the rest of us see you," she said. "How do you see me?" I asked, genuinely curious. "As someone brilliant and driven and kind. As someone who's overcome more challenges than most people will ever face. As someone who's going to change the world, probably in ways you can't even imagine yet." Her words settled into something deep inside me, filling spaces that had been empty for far too long. For the first time in my life, I began to consider the possibility that she might be right. Graduate school began in late August with an orientation that felt both familiar and completely new. The University of Colorado Denver campus was larger and more diverse than Boulder, filled with graduate students from around the world who had come to pursue advanced degrees in everything from medicine to engineering to public policy. My program was small and intensive, with just 12 students in my incoming cohort. We were a mix of backgrounds and experiences, but united by our shared commitment to pushing the boundaries of biomedical research. The faculty were internationally recognized experts in their fields, and the research opportunities were exactly what I'd hoped for. My advisor, Dr. Maria Rodriguez, was a powerhouse in the field of tissue engineering, who had published groundbreaking work on cellular regeneration. She was also the first person in an academic setting to directly address my scars, but in a way that was clinical rather than personal. "I see you have experience with burn injuries," she said during our first meeting, gesturing toward my arm. "That perspective could be valuable in our work if you're comfortable incorporating it." The directness was jarring but also refreshing. Instead of pretending my scars didn't exist or treating them as something to be carefully avoided in conversation, she was acknowledging them as potentially relevant to my research. It was the first time anyone had suggested that my experience might be an asset rather than a liability. "I'd like to focus on developing better treatment protocols for pediatric burn patients," I said. "I think there's room for significant improvement in how we approach both the medical and psychological aspects of recovery." Dr. Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully. "That's ambitious work. Are you prepared for the emotional challenges that come with research in that area?" It was the same question Dr. Torres had asked, and I gave the same answer. "I think I need to do this work. I think it's what I'm meant to contribute." "Good," she said simply. "Passion and personal investment can be powerful motivators, as long as you maintain scientific objectivity." The first semester was intense in ways I hadn't anticipated. The coursework was demanding, requiring a depth of understanding that went far beyond undergraduate study. I was taking advanced classes in biochemistry, materials science, and bioethics, while also beginning preliminary research in Dr. Rodriguez's lab. The research was fascinating but emotionally complex. We were working on developing new skin grafting techniques that could reduce scarring and improve functional outcomes for burn victims. Every day, I was surrounded by images and case studies that reminded me of my own experience, but from a scientific rather than personal perspective. It was during this period that I began to understand how my scars might actually be an advantage in my research. I had an intuitive understanding of the patient experience that my colleagues lacked. I knew what it felt like to live with visible damage, to navigate social situations while managing other people's discomfort, to balance the desire for normal appearance with acceptance of permanent change. This perspective informed my approach to research in ways that surprised even me. While my colleagues focused primarily on the technical aspects of graft integration and cellular response, I found myself also considering quality of life outcomes, psychological adaptation, and long-term social functioning. "You think about these problems differently than most researchers," Dr. Rodriguez observed during one of our weekly meetings. "You're considering factors that others might overlook. Is that good or bad?" I asked. "It's valuable," she said. "Science needs different perspectives to advance. Your background gives you insights that could lead to breakthrough approaches." As the semester progressed, I felt myself settling into graduate school life with growing confidence. I was making friends among my cohort, participating in departmental seminars, and contributing to research discussions in ways that felt natural and valuable. One evening in November, I was working late in the lab when I received a text message from Caleb. It was the first time he'd contacted me directly since I'd left for college, and the message was brief. "Heard you're still in school. When are you planning to get a real job?" I stared at the message for a long moment, feeling the familiar sting of his dismissiveness. But this time, something else accompanied the hurt, a kind of clarity I hadn't possessed before. I was doing meaningful work that I loved, pursuing a career that would allow me to help others while contributing to scientific knowledge. I was financially independent, emotionally stable, and surrounded by people who respected my abilities and supported my goals. By any reasonable measure, I was succeeding. His definition of a real job was irrelevant to my life and my value. His inability to understand the significance of what I was doing was a limitation he would have to live with, not a problem I needed to solve. I deleted the message without responding and returned to my work. There were experiments to design, data to analyze, papers to read. I had important work to do, and for the first time in my life that felt like enough justification for my choices. The breakthrough came in my second semester, during a late-night session in the lab when I was experimenting with a new approach to scaffold design. I'd been working on incorporating growth factors into biodegradable materials in a way that would promote more natural healing response. Most of my attempts had shown marginal improvement over existing techniques, but this particular combination of materials and delivery methods produced results that made me double-check my equipment. The cellular response was extraordinary, not just faster healing, but healing that resulted in tissue that was functionally and aesthetically superior to anything I'd seen in previous studies. I ran the experiment 3 more times to make sure I wasn't making an error, and each time the results were consistent. Dr. Rodriguez was equally excited when I showed her the data the next morning. "This could be significant," she said, studying the images I'd captured. "If we can replicate these results and scale up the technique, it could revolutionize burn treatment." We spent the next several months refining the approach, testing it under different conditions, and documenting every aspect of the process. The results remained consistently impressive, and by the end of the academic year, we had enough data to begin preparing for publication in a major journal. "I want you to be first author on this paper," Dr. Rodriguez told me as we outlined our publication strategy. "This is your discovery, your innovation. You deserve the recognition." First author on a potentially groundbreaking paper in my first year of graduate school. It was an achievement that exceeded my wildest expectations, validation that I belonged in this world of cutting-edge research and scientific discovery. When the paper was accepted for publication in the Journal of Biomedical Materials Research, I felt a satisfaction that was deeper and more complete than any recognition I'd received before. This wasn't just academic success. It was proof that I could contribute something meaningful to the world, that my work had value beyond personal accomplishment. I called Priya first, screaming the news into the phone with uncharacteristic exuberance. She screamed back, both of us laughing at the sheer joy of the moment. "You did it," she said when we finally calmed down. "You actually did it." "I can't believe it's real," I said, looking at the acceptance email for the 100th time. "Believe it," she said, echoing her words from months earlier. "You're not the same person who was afraid to present at that conference. You're becoming exactly who you were meant to be." That night, I sat in my apartment, looking out at the Denver skyline, thinking about the journey that had brought me to this moment. 2 years earlier, I'd been a college student afraid to show my scars, convinced that my family's limitations were also my own. Now I was a published researcher making genuine contributions to a field that could help thousands of people. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, and it hadn't been easy. It had required questioning beliefs I'd held for years, building confidence despite constant discouragement, and learning to value my own judgment over other people's opinion. But perhaps most importantly, it had required recognizing that my scars, the very thing my family had taught me to hide and be ashamed of, could actually be a source of strength and insight. They had given me perspective that informed my research, motivation that sustained me through difficult moments, and empathy that connected me to the people I hoped to help. For the first time in my life, I felt genuinely proud of who I was becoming, and I was just getting started. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning in late September, delivered via email with the official letterhead of the Millbrook Healthcare Innovation Awards. I almost deleted it, assuming it was spam or some kind of mistaken correspondence. But something about the sender's name caught my attention: Dr. Patricia Hensley, whom I recognized as a prominent figure in Colorado's medical research community. "Dear Dr. Hoffman," the email began, and I had to read that twice before the reality sank in. Someone was addressing me as Dr. Hoffman, acknowledging the doctorate I'd earned just 3 months earlier, after defending a dissertation that had already generated significant interest in the scientific community. "We would be honored to have you serve as our keynote speaker at this year's Millbrook Healthcare Innovation Award. Your groundbreaking research in pediatric burn treatment has garnered national attention, and we believe our community would benefit tremendously from hearing about your work." I read the email 3 times, each pass revealing new details that seemed almost too good to be true. The event was scheduled for November, which gave me plenty of time to prepare. The honorarium was more than generous, and most importantly, it was taking place in Millbrook, my hometown, the place where I'd spent years being treated as damaged goods by the very people who should have supported me most. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same community that had watched my family treat me with barely concealed shame was now inviting me to return as a distinguished guest, someone whose achievements were worthy of celebration and recognition. It felt like the universe offering me a chance to rewrite the narrative that had defined the first 2 decades of my life. I sat in my Denver office, surrounded by the awards and publications that marked my rapid ascent in the biomedical research field, and tried to process what this invitation really meant. Over the past year, my research had gained momentum in ways I'd never anticipated. The paper Dr. Rodriguez and I had published had been cited extensively, leading to speaking engagements at conferences across the country. I'd been featured in Scientific American, interviewed for medical journals, and invited to consult on treatment protocols at major burn centers. But none of those achievements had prepared me for the emotional complexity of returning to Millbrook, as the very person my family had convinced me I could never become. I called Priya first, as I did with all major life development. She was now working as an environmental consultant in Portland, but we'd maintained our friendship despite the geographical distance. "Please tell me you're going to accept," she said after I'd read her the invitation. "I don't know," I admitted. "It feels complicated." "Complicated? How? You've earned this recognition. You've done incredible work that's helping people. Why wouldn't you want to share that with your hometown?" I struggled to articulate the tangle of emotions the invitation had triggered. Pride, certainly, but also anxiety about seeing my family again after minimal contact for several years. Excitement about showcasing my work, but also dread about opening myself up to their judgment and criticism. "What if they don't come?" I asked, voicing a fear I hadn't fully acknowledged. "What if they do?" Priya countered. "What if they finally have to see you the way everyone else sees you, as someone brilliant and accomplished and worthy of respect? What if seeing me succeed just makes them angry? What if they find ways to diminish it, to make it about something other than my work?" Priya was quiet for a moment, and I could almost hear her choosing her words carefully. "Zara, you can't control how they react. You can only control how you show up." And the woman I know would show up with confidence, with grace, and with pride in what she's accomplished. That evening I walked through downtown Denver, trying to clear my head and think through the decision objectively. The city was beautiful in the early fall, with golden leaves creating a canopy over the sidewalks and the mountains visible in the distance. I'd built a good life here, surrounded by colleagues who respected my work and friends who valued my company. But there was something appealing about the idea of returning to Millbrook, not as the ashamed, apologetic girl who'd left for college, but as Dr. Zara Hoffman, a researcher whose work was changing lives. It would be a chance to complete a circle, to show my younger self that the dreams she'd barely dared to dream were not only possible but inevitable. I made the decision that night, sitting in my apartment with a cup of tea and the acceptance email open on my laptop. I would return to Millbrook, not to prove anything to my family, but to honor the journey that had brought me to this point. "Thank you for this incredible opportunity," I typed. "I would be honored to serve as your keynote speaker." The next 2 months passed in a blur of preparation. I crafted a presentation that balanced scientific rigor with accessibility, knowing that my audience would include medical professionals, community leaders, and ordinary citizens who might not have technical backgrounds, but would understand the human impact of my research. The core of my talk focused on the breakthrough treatment protocol I'd developed, which had already been implemented at several major medical centers with remarkable results. Children who might have faced years of reconstructive surgery and psychological trauma were healing with minimal scarring and faster recovery times. The techniques I'd pioneered were giving families hope where there had previously been only despair. But I also planned to speak about the broader implications of my work, the importance of patient-centered research, the value of diverse perspectives in scientific inquiry, and the power of turning personal experience into professional purpose. It was the kind of presentation that required vulnerability as well as expertise, and I found myself both nervous and excited about the opportunity to share my story. 3 weeks before the event, I received a call from my mother. It was the first time we'd spoken in over 6 months, and her voice carried an unfamiliar note of uncertainty. "We heard about the awards ceremony," she said without preamble. Congratulations. Thank you, I replied, unsure where the conversation was heading. We're planning to attend, she continued. Your father thought it would be nice to support you. Support? The word felt strange coming from her, loaded with implications I wasn't sure how to interpret. Were they genuinely proud of my achievements, or were they simply curious about the attention I was receiving? Did they see this as an opportunity to reconnect, or were they worried about how their absence might look to the community? That's wonderful, I said, choosing diplomacy over interrogation. I'm sure it will be a nice event. Caleb and Ivy are planning to come too, she added. It'll be like a family reunion. A family reunion, as if the years of distance and silence had been a temporary misunderstanding rather than a deliberate choice on my part to prioritize my mental health and professional development. After we hung up, I sat in my office trying to process the conversation. Part of me was genuinely pleased that they wanted to attend. Despite everything, they were still my family, and some small part of me had always hoped for their recognition and approval. But I was also wary of their motivations and realistic about the likelihood that this event would somehow repair our fractured relationships. Too much had happened, too many words had been left unspoken, for a single evening to undo years of accumulated hurt and disappointment. I decided to focus on what I could control, delivering a presentation that honored both my professional achievements and personal journey. Whatever happened with my family would happen, but it wouldn't diminish the significance of what I'd accomplished or the importance of the work I was doing. The week before the event, I drove to Millbrook to meet with the organizing committee and do a final walkthrough of the venue. The town looked smaller than I remembered, but also more charming. The main street had been revitalized with new shops and restaurants, and there was an energy about the place that felt different from the sleepy community I'd grown up in. The awards ceremony was being held at the newly renovated Millbrook Community Center, a beautiful space with soaring ceilings and large windows that let in natural light. The organizers had clearly put significant effort into making the event feel special, with elegant table settings, professional lighting, and a stage that commanded attention without feeling intimidating. Dr. Hensley, the committee chair, was warm and enthusiastic as she showed me around the space. She was roughly my mother's age, with silver hair and laugh lines that suggested someone who found joy in her work. We're so excited to have you, she said as we reviewed the evening's timeline. Your research has already helped 2 children in our community. The Martinez family specifically asked me to thank you. Their daughter Elena was treated using your protocol after an accident last year, and her recovery exceeded everyone's expectation. The mention of a local child who had benefited from my work added a layer of meaning to the event that I hadn't anticipated. This wasn't just about recognition or personal vindication, it was about the real-world impact of research that had grown out of my own experience with trauma and healing. That evening, I had dinner at a small restaurant downtown, choosing a table by the window where I could watch people walking by. Some faces were familiar, aged versions of classmates or neighbors I'd known years earlier. A few people recognized me and offered polite waves, though I couldn't tell if they knew about the awards ceremony or simply remembered me as the Hoffman girl who'd gone away to college. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, with the kind of perfect autumn weather that makes Colorado famous. I spent the day in my hotel room, reviewing my presentation one final time, and trying to manage the nervous energy that had been building for weeks. I'd chosen my outfit carefully, a sophisticated navy dress with a matching blazer that struck the right balance between professional authority and approachable warmth. For the first time in years, I'd deliberately chosen something sleeveless, with only the blazer covering my scar. It felt like a statement, though I wasn't entirely sure what I was trying to say. As the afternoon wore on, I found myself thinking about the 7-year-old girl who had survived that house fire, who had endured years of skin grafts and physical therapy, who had learned to navigate a world that often treated her scars as something shameful to be hidden. That little girl could never have imagined that those very scars would one day inform groundbreaking research that was helping other children heal. There was something profound about that connection, about the way trauma and triumph could be part of the same story. My scars weren't just evidence of what I'd survived, they were the foundation of what I'd built. At 5 o'clock I made my way to the community center. The parking lot was already filling with cars and I could see people in formal attire making their way toward the entrance. There was an excitement in the air,
the kind of energy that comes with community celebrations and shared pride. I was scheduled to arrive early for photos and final preparations, so I entered through a side door that led directly to the green room. Dr. Hensley was there waiting for me, along with several other committee members who greeted me with genuine warmth and enthusiasm. "Are you nervous?" asked Janet Morrison, the committee's vice chair. "A little," I admitted, "but also excited. This feels like coming full circle in a way." "Your family must be so proud," Dr. Hensley said. "It's wonderful when hometown success stories can inspire the next generation." I smiled and nodded, not trusting myself to comment on my family's pride or lack thereof. Whatever happened this evening, I was determined to focus on the positive aspects of the experience, rather than getting caught up in old patterns of disappointment and resentment. At 6:30, the reception began in the community center's main hall. I mingled with attendees, many of whom were healthcare professionals, local business leaders, and community volunteers. The conversations were engaging and affirming, filled with questions about my research and appreciation for the work I was doing. It was during this reception that I saw my family standing near the appetizer table, looking slightly uncomfortable but undeniably present. My mother had dressed up for the occasion, wearing a black dress I'd never seen before. My father looked awkward in a suit that seemed too formal for his usual style. Caleb had grown a beard since I'd last seen him, and he was wearing a button-down shirt that suggested he'd made an effort to dress appropriate. Ivy, now 21 and finishing college herself, looked polished and mature in a way that reminded me how much time had passed. They saw me at almost the same moment I noticed them, and for a few seconds we simply looked at each other across the crowded room. The moment felt loaded with years of unspoken words and unresolved tensions. My mother was the first to move, walking toward me with a smile that seemed both genuine and uncertain. "Zara, honey, you look beautiful." "Thank you," I said, accepting her brief hug. "I'm glad you could make it." The rest of the family approached more tentatively, offering congratulations that felt stilted but sincere. We made small talk about the venue, the turnout, and the unseasonably warm weather. It was the kind of superficial conversation we'd perfected over the years, pleasant enough on the surface, but carefully avoiding any topics that might lead to deeper discussion. "We're very proud of you," my father said, the words sounding slightly rehearsed.
"This is quite an honor." "It is," I agreed. "Thank you for being here." Caleb surprised me by being the most direct. "I've been reading about your research online," he said. "It's pretty impressive stuff. I'm sorry I didn't understand it better before." It wasn't exactly an apology for years of dismissive comments, but it was acknowledgement of a kind I'd never received from him before. I appreciated the gesture, even if it came years too late to heal the wounds his words had inflicted. Ivy hung back slightly, and I could see something in her expression that looked like regret or perhaps guilt. She was old enough now to understand the family dynamics that had shaped our childhood, recognize the ways my achievements had been minimized or ignored. "I'm really excited to hear your speech," she said quietly. "I want to understand what you've been working on." At 7 o'clock, we moved into the main hall for dinner and the awards presentation. The room had been transformed with elegant lighting and carefully arranged seating. I was seated at the head table with other honorees and community leaders, which gave me a clear view of the audience, but also made me acutely aware of being watched. My family was seated at a table near the front, close enough that I could see their faces clearly but far enough away that we couldn't easily communicate during the meal. I found myself glancing in their direction periodically, trying to read their expressions and gauge their reactions to the evening's proceeding. The dinner conversation at my table was engaging, filled with discussions about healthcare innovation, community development, and the importance of supporting local talent. Hensley told stories about previous award recipients, many of whom had gone on to make significant contributions in their fields. "You're part of a distinguished group," she said. "We've had Nobel Prize winners, pioneering surgeons, and researchers whose work has changed the standard of care in their specialties." The weight of that tradition felt both humbling and inspiring. I was being inducted into a community of achievement that valued excellence, innovation, and service to others. It was everything I'd worked toward, but it also represented a level of recognition I'd never dared to expect. As the dinner concluded and the formal program began, I felt my nervousness return. In a few minutes, I would be standing on that stage, sharing my story and my work with an audience that included the people who had shaped my early understanding of my own work. The other awards were presented first: recognition for a local doctor who had pioneered new cardiac procedures, a nurse whose patient advocacy had changed hospital policies, and a medical administrator whose leadership had improved healthcare access throughout the region. Each recipient gave brief remarks and the applause was warm and genuine. Then Dr. Hensley approached the podium to introduce me, and I felt my heart rate accelerate. This was it, the moment I'd been preparing for. The opportunity to share my journey and my work with the community that had watched me grow up. Our keynote speaker tonight is someone who truly embodies the spirit of innovation and perseverance that these awards celebrate. Dr. Hensley began. Zara Hoffman grew up right here in Millbrook, where she first developed her interest in science and healing. After completing her undergraduate studies at the University of Colorado Boulder, she earned her doctorate in biomedical engineering from UC Denver, where her groundbreaking research in pediatric burn treatment has already saved lives and improved outcomes for children around the world. She continued with a summary of my achievements, publications, patents, speaking engagements, and clinical implementations of my research. Hearing it all laid out like that, I was struck by how much I'd accomplished in a relatively short time. The shy, ashamed girl who had left Millbrook for college had become someone whose work was making a genuine difference in the world. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Zara Hoffman. The applause was thunderous as I stood and made my way to the podium. The stage lights were bright enough that I couldn't see individual faces in the audience, which was both disappointing and relieving. I'd wanted to make eye contact with my family, to see their reactions in real time, but the anonymity of the crowd also made it easier to focus on my message rather than their judgment. I began with the story of the house fire, setting the stage for everything that followed. I talked about the months of recovery, the years of living with visible scars, and the way those experiences had shaped my understanding of trauma and healing. The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. For a long time, I saw my scars as evidence of damage. I said, my voice steady despite the emotion behind the words. I was taught to hide them, to be ashamed of them, to see them as something that made me less than whole, but my work has taught me something different. These scars represent survival, resilience, and ultimately, the motivation to help others heal. I talked about my research, explaining the technical innovations in terms that lay people could understand while maintaining the scientific rigor that gave credibility to my work. I showed before and after photos of patients who had been treated using my protocols, children whose healing had exceeded all expectation. The little girl who survived that fire in 1995 could never have imagined that her scars would one day inform research that helps other children heal faster and more completely. I said. But that's the power of transformation, taking our wounds and turning them into wisdom, our pain into purpose. As I spoke, I found myself gaining confidence and momentum. This wasn't just a professional presentation, it was a declaration of who I'd become and what I stood for. I was claiming my place in this community not as someone seeking acceptance, but as someone offering gifts born from my own journey through darkness and into light. Tonight I want to thank this community for supporting my education and early development, even when I didn't always feel that support directly, I said, glancing toward where I knew my family was sitting. And I want to challenge all of us to see potential in unexpected places, to recognize that our greatest strengths often grow from our deepest challenges. The speech concluded with a call to action about supporting scientific research and healthcare innovation, but also about creating communities where young people feel encouraged to pursue their dreams regardless of their circumstances or appearance. When I finished, the applause was immediate and sustained. People rose to their feet, and I could see Dr. Hensley wiping tears from her eyes. The response was more enthusiastic than I'd dared to hope, validation that my message had resonated with the audience. As the applause continued, I finally spotted my family in the crowd. They were standing with everyone else, clapping, but their expressions were complex mixtures of pride, surprise, and something that might have been regret. For the first time in my life, they were seeing me as other people saw me, as someone accomplished and worthy of respect. When I stepped down from the podium, I was immediately surrounded by people wanting to talk about my research, to share their own stories of medical challenges, to express gratitude for the work I was doing. It was overwhelming in the best possible way, a reminder that my work had meaning beyond personal achievement. Eventually, the crowd thinned enough for my family to approach. They looked different somehow. Smaller, less certain of themselves. The dynamic between us had shifted fundamentally, and we all seemed to be struggling to navigate this new territory. "That was an incredible speech," my mother said, her voice thick with emotion. "I had no idea. I knew you were successful, but I didn't understand what your work really meant." "It was beautiful," Ivy added, tears in her eyes. "I'm sorry we didn't support you better when you were younger." My father and Caleb were quieter, but I could see them processing what they'd heard. For years, they'd dismissed my achievements as academic exercises, with little real-world value. Tonight, they'd heard me speak about research that was literally saving lives, about work that was changing the standard of care for burn victims around the world. "Thank you for coming," I said simply. "It means a lot to have you here." We talked for a few more minutes, carefully navigating conversation that acknowledged the significance of the evening without diving too deeply into the years of hurt that lay between us. It wasn't reconciliation, exactly, but it was recognition, their acknowledgement, that I'd become someone worthy of their respect, and my acceptance of that acknowledgement without requiring an apology for everything that had come before. As the evening wound down and people began to leave, I found myself alone for a moment in the empty auditorium. The stage was still lit, the podium still standing where I'd delivered the most important speech of my life. I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment, the years of hiding my scars, of apologizing for my existence, of believing that I was somehow less worthy of love and respect because of my appearance, and then the gradual awakening to my own potential, the discovery of work that gave meaning to my suffering, the recognition that my scars could be a source of strength rather than shame. Standing there in the quiet of that space, I felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with my family's approval or the community's recognition. I had become the person I was meant to be, not despite my scars but because of them. The girl who had been ashamed of her appearance had grown into a woman who was changing the world. The applause had ended, the awards had been given, and the recognition had been received. But the real victory was quieter and more personal. It was the knowledge that I had refused to let other people's limitations become my own, that I had turned my wounds into wisdom, and that I was finally, fully, unapologetically myself. The morning after the awards ceremony, I woke up in my hotel room feeling both exhilarated and emotionally drained. The previous evening had exceeded my expectations in every way that mattered, but now came the more complicated task of processing what it all meant for my relationships with my family and my connection to Millbrook. I was scheduled to check out at 11, but my phone had been buzzing since 7 with messages, missed calls and notifications. The local newspaper wanted an interview. A Denver television station had gotten wind of the story and was requesting a follow-up segment. 3 different medical conferences had reached out about speaking opportunities. Even more unexpectedly, I'd received several messages from former classmates who had seen coverage of the event and wanted to reconnect. But the message that caught my attention was from my mother, sent at 6:30 in the morning. "Could we have breakfast before you leave? There are things we should discuss." I stared at the text for a long moment, uncertain whether I was ready for whatever conversation she had in mind. The previous evening had been carefully choreographed, with formal presentations and public recognition providing structure for our interactions. A private breakfast would strip away those buffers and force us to confront years of accumulated hurt and misunderstanding. I texted back that I could meet them at the Summit Cafe at 9, the same place where I'd worked during the summer before college. It seemed fitting to return to a location that held memories of my transition from adolescence to independence. The cafe looked exactly as I remembered it, down to the mismatched furniture and the hand-painted menu board behind the counter. Rosa, the owner, was still there, though her hair had gone completely gray in the intervening years. She recognized me immediately and enveloped me in a warm hug. "Look at you," she said, beaming with genuine pride. "Dr. Hoffman, I watched the live stream of your speech last night. I was crying by the end." "You watched it?" I asked, surprised that the event had been broadcast. "The whole town was talking about it," she said. "Everyone's so proud. You've made quite a name for yourself." My family arrived a few minutes later, looking more subdued than they had the previous evening. The formal clothes had been replaced with casual wear, and without the buffer of a crowd and structured event,
The awkwardness between us was more apparent. We ordered coffee and pastries, making small talk about the weather and the changes to downtown Millbrook while we waited for our food, but I could feel the weight of unspoken topics hovering over the table like storm clouds. My father was the first to break through the superficial conversation. "We owe you an apology," he said abruptly, his voice rougher than usual. "After hearing you speak last night, after understanding what you've accomplished, we realize we haven't been the parents you deserved." The directness of his statement caught me off guard. I'd expected deflection, qualification, perhaps some attempt to reframe their behavior as misguided, but well-intentioned support. I hadn't expected this kind of stark acknowledgement. "We were scared," my mother added, her voice barely above a whisper. "After the fire, after seeing you hurt so badly, we didn't know how to help you. We thought if we didn't talk about it, if we helped you blend in and not draw attention to your scars, that would be better for you. But we were wrong," Caleb said, surprising me with his participation in what felt like a rehearsed confession. "We made you feel ashamed of something that was never shameful. We made you think you had to hide who you were." Ivy was crying quietly, her pastry untouched in front of her. "I've been thinking about this for years," she said, "about how differently we treated you, about how we made you feel like you had to earn love instead of just receiving it." I sat listening to their words, feeling a complex mixture of validation and sadness. This was the acknowledgement I'd craved for years, the recognition that their behavior had been harmful rather than protective, but it was also coming 20 years too late, after I'd already done the hard work of healing and self-acceptance on my own. "I appreciate you saying this," I said carefully. "I really do, but I need you to understand that I can't go back and be the daughter who needed your approval and support. I've had to learn to validate myself, to trust my own judgment, to build a life that doesn't depend on your recognition." "We know," my mother said, tears streaming down her face. "We know we missed our chance to be the parents you needed, but we want to try to be the parents you deserve now, if you'll let us." The conversation continued for over an hour, with each family member sharing their own perspective on our history and their regrets about how they'd handled my childhood trauma and subsequent achievement. It was painful but also cathartic, like lancing a wound that had been festering for decades. But even as I appreciated their honesty and apparent remorse, I found myself maintaining emotional distance. Their apologies couldn't undo the years of feeling unwanted and ashamed. Their newfound pride in my achievements couldn't erase the memory of being treated as an embarrassment, a problem to be managed rather than a daughter to be celebrated. "I don't know what our relationship looks like going forward," I said as we prepared to leave. "I'm not angry anymore, but I'm also not the same person who used to desperately want your approval. I've built a good life without it, and I'm not willing to sacrifice my peace of mind to rebuild something that was never healthy to begin with." "We understand," my father said. "We just want you to know that we see you now. We see who you are and what you've accomplished, and we're proud of you." "I'm glad," I said, and I meant it, "but I need you to understand that I can't make that enough to heal everything that happened." We hugged goodbye, and I could feel the genuine affection in their embraces, but I could also feel the weight of realistic expectations. This wasn't a movie reconciliation where years of hurt could be resolved with a single conversation. It was the beginning of a process that might lead to something healthier, but only if we all committed to doing the work required. Driving back to Denver, I found myself processing the morning's conversation alongside the previous evening's triumph. The awards ceremony had been validation from the community I'd grown up in, recognition that I'd become someone worthy of respect and celebration. The breakfast conversation had been something different, acknowledgement from my family that they'd failed me, but also clarity that their approval was no longer necessary for my happiness. The week that followed was a whirlwind of professional opportunities and media attention. The local coverage of the awards ceremony had been picked up by regional outlets, which led to national interest in my research and personal story. I found myself fielding interview requests, speaking proposals and collaboration offers from researchers and institutions around the country. The attention was flattering but also overwhelming. I'd spent years building my career methodically, focusing on the work rather than self-promotion. Suddenly finding myself in the spotlight required adjustment, and careful navigation of opportunities that could enhance my impact versus those that might distract from my research priorities. Dr. Rodriguez was both proud and protective as we discussed how to handle the increased visibility. "Recognition is wonderful," she told me during one of our weekly meetings, "but remember that your primary obligation is to the work itself. Don't let the attention become more important than the research." It was sound advice that I tried to follow as I evaluated the various opportunities coming my way. I accepted speaking engagements that would allow me to share my research with relevant audience. I agreed to interviews with medical journals and science publications that could help disseminate my findings, but I turned down television appearances that seemed more interested in my personal story than my professional contribution. One opportunity that did capture my attention was an invitation to consult on a major pediatric burn center's treatment protocols. Children's Hospital Colorado wanted to implement my research on a larger scale and needed guidance on adaptation and staff training. It was exactly the kind of real-world application that gave meaning to my work. The consultation process required several trips to the hospital over the course of a month, working with doctors, nurses, and therapists to modify existing procedures and develop new ones based on my research. It was challenging work that demanded both technical expertise and interpersonal skills, but it was also deeply fulfilling. During one of these visits, I met Elena Martinez, the little girl Dr. Hensley had mentioned, whose recovery had been aided by my treatment protocol. She was 8 years old, with bright eyes and an infectious smile, and her left arm bore scars similar to mine, but dramatically less severe than what would have been expected under previous treatment methods. "Are you the doctor who helped make my arm better?" she asked, when her mother introduced us. "I helped develop some of the treatments your doctors used," I explained, "but your doctors and nurses are the ones who took such good care of you." "My scars don't hurt anymore," she said matter-of-factly, "and they're getting smaller. Mama says they make me special." Her casual acceptance of her scars, her lack of shame or self-consciousness, represented everything I hoped my research could achieve. She would grow up in a world where her scars were just part of her story, not the defining characteristic that overshadowed everything else about her. Her mother, Carmen Martinez, was effusive in her gratitude. "The doctors told us about your research, about how your own experience inspired your work," she said. "I want Elena to know that sometimes the hardest things we go through can help us help other people." That conversation stayed with me for days afterward. Elena's confident self-acceptance was what I'd been working toward, not just better medical outcomes, but better emotional outcomes for children who would grow up with visible differences. But not everyone was supportive of my increased visibility and the attention my work was receiving. About 2 weeks after the awards ceremony, I received an email that made my stomach drop. It was from Dr. Marcus Webb, a prominent researcher in my field, who had been working on similar problems for decades, without achieving the breakthroughs my work had produced. "Dear Dr. Halfman," the email began with formal coldness, "while I congratulate you on your recent recognition, I feel compelled to express concern about the way your research has been presented to the public and the media." He went on to question whether my personal connection to burn injuries had compromised my scientific objectivity, suggesting that my work might be more driven by emotion than rigorous methodology. He implied that the attention I was receiving was disproportionate to my actual contributions, and hinted that other researchers with longer track records deserved equal recognition.
The email was carefully worded to avoid direct accusations, but the underlying message was clear. He believed I was an opportunist, trading on personal tragedy rather than a legitimate scientist, making genuine contributions to the field. I showed the email to Dr. Rodriguez, who read it with a mixture of anger and disappointment. "This is unfortunately typical," she said. "When someone achieves recognition in a field dominated by established figures, there's often pushback. The fact that you're young and that your work challenges existing approaches makes you a target for this kind of criticism." "Is there any validity to what he's saying?" I asked, genuinely concerned that my personal investment in the research might have clouded my judgment. "Absolutely not," she said firmly. "Your methodology has been rigorously peer-reviewed. Your results have been replicated by multiple independent labs. Your personal experience gave you insights that led to innovations, but the science behind those innovations is unassailable. Despite her reassurance, Dr. Webb's criticism stung more than I wanted to admit. It played into insecurities I'd been carrying for years, the fear that I didn't truly belong in academic circles, that my achievements were somehow less legitimate because of my background. But the challenge also galvanized me in unexpected ways. Instead of retreating from the spotlight or second-guessing my work, I decided to engage more directly with the scientific community. I accepted invitations to present at major conferences, submitted additional papers for publication, and sought out collaboration opportunities with other researchers. The response from the broader scientific community was overwhelmingly positive. My presentations were well received, my papers were accepted by top-tier journals, and requests for collaboration continued to increase. It became clear that Dr. Webb's perspective was not representative of the field as a whole. One particularly satisfying moment came when Dr. Jennifer Kim, a researcher at Johns Hopkins whose work I'd long admired, approached me after a presentation at a biomedical engineering conference in San Francisco. "I've been following your research for the past year," she said. "The insights you've brought to this field are exactly what we've been missing. Your personal perspective hasn't compromised your science, it's enhanced it in ways that purely theoretical approaches couldn't achieve." She went on to propose a collaboration that would combine her expertise in cellular biology with my innovations in treatment protocols. It was the kind of partnership that could advance both of our research programs while addressing larger questions about trauma recovery and tissue regeneration. As I flew back to Denver after that conference, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. A year earlier, I'd been a graduate student focused primarily on completing my dissertation. Now I was being recognized as a leader in my field, someone whose work was changing lives, and whose perspective was valued by colleagues around the world. But perhaps more importantly, I'd learned to navigate criticism and self-doubt without losing confidence in my abilities or the value of my work. Webb's attempt to undermine my credibility had initially shaken me, but ultimately it had forced me to articulate more clearly why my research mattered, and why my approach was both scientifically sound and practically important. The collaboration with Dr. Kim progressed quickly, with both of us excited about the potential for breakthrough discoveries. We began with video conferences and shared data analysis, then progressed to in-person meetings and joint grant applications. The chemistry between our research approaches was immediately apparent, and we were able to identify several promising avenues for investigation. One project that particularly excited us involved developing personalized treatment protocols based on individual patient characteristics. My original research had focused on improving outcomes for pediatric burn patients generally, but this new work would allow for customization based on factors like age, burn severity, healing patterns, and psychological resilience. The complexity of the research required assembling a larger team, including specialists in psychology, dermatology, and bioengineering. As the project grew, I found myself in an unexpected role as a team leader, coordinating between different disciplines and ensuring that our various expertise areas were integrated effectively. It was challenging work that demanded skills I'd never formally developed: project management, team leadership, interdisciplinary communication. But it was also energizing in ways I hadn't anticipated. I discovered that I had a talent for synthesizing different perspectives and helping team members from various backgrounds understand how their contributions fit into the larger research goal. 6 months after the awards ceremony, we received notification that our grant application had been approved for funding. The National Institutes of Health had awarded us nearly $2 million over 3 years to pursue the personalized treatment protocol research. It was a career-defining moment that positioned me as a principal investigator on a major federal research project. The day the funding notification arrived, I called Priya to share the news. She screamed with excitement so loudly that I had to hold the phone away from my ear. "This is incredible," she said when she finally calmed down. "Do you realize what this means? You're not just a researcher anymore. You're leading the field in this area." She was right, and the realization was both thrilling and daunting. With this level of funding and visibility came responsibilities I'd never faced before. I would be accountable not just for my own work, but for the progress and productivity of an entire research team. The stakes, felt higher than anything I'd previously encountered. But I also felt ready for the challenge in ways I might not have a year earlier. The events of the past months, the awards ceremony, the family confrontation, the professional criticism, the collaboration opportunities had all contributed to a growing sense of confidence in my abilities and judgment. I was no longer the insecure graduate student desperate for approval from authority figures. I wasn't the damaged child trying to prove her worth through academic achievement. I was Zara Hoffman, a researcher whose work was making a genuine difference in the world. Someone whose perspective and expertise were valued by colleagues and institutions around the country. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. And it wasn't complete. I still struggled sometimes with imposter syndrome, still had moments of doubt about whether I truly belonged in the spaces I now occupied, but those moments were becoming less frequent and less paralyzing as I accumulated evidence of my competence and impact. As I began planning the launch of the new research project, I found myself thinking about the 8-year-old Elena Martinez and her matter-of-fact acceptance of her scars. She represented the future I was working toward, a world where children like us could grow up confident in their worth, focused on their potential rather than limited by their differences. The work was far from finished. There were still breakthrough discoveries to be made, treatment protocols to be refined, lives to be improved through scientific innovation. But for the first time in my career, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged, doing exactly the work I was meant to do. The battle for recognition and respect had been won, but more importantly, I'd won the battle for self-acceptance and confidence in my own abilities. Whatever challenges lay ahead, I was ready to face them as the person I'd become rather than the person I'd once been. 2 years after receiving the NIH grant, I stood in the brand new Hoffman Center for Regenerative Medicine at Children's Hospital, Colorado, watching construction workers put the finishing touches on what would become one of the most advanced pediatric burn treatment facilities in the world. The center bore my name, a surreal honor that still made me pause whenever I saw it written on official documents or building signs. The facility represented the culmination of everything I'd worked toward since that first breakthrough in graduate school. 3 floors of cutting-edge laboratories, treatment rooms equipped with the latest technology, and family support spaces designed to make the healing process as comfortable as possible for children and their parents. It was more than a medical facility. It was a physical manifestation of the idea that trauma could be transformed into hope. Dr. Kim joined me in the empty lobby, both of us wearing hard hats and safety vests as we toured the nearly completed space. Our collaboration had exceeded every expectation, resulting in treatment protocols that were now being used in pediatric hospitals across the country and internationally. The personalized medicine approach we'd developed had reduced healing times by an average of 40%, while dramatically minimizing scarring and psychological trauma. "Can you believe this is really happening?" she asked, gesturing toward the gleaming hallways and state-of-the-art equipment being wheeled into place. "Sometimes I have to pinch myself," I admitted. When I was growing up, I never imagined that my scars would lead to something like this. The center was scheduled to open in 3 months, with a ribbon-cutting ceremony that would include medical professionals, government officials, and families who had been helped by our research. The planning was extensive, involving media coordination, tours for potential donors, and presentations about the innovative work being done here. But the opening I was most looking forward to was smaller and more personal. A special preview day for burn survivors and their families, an opportunity for the community we served to see the facility before it became operational. I'd insisted on this event because I wanted the center to feel accessible and welcoming rather than intimidating and clinical. The invitation list included families from across Colorado and neighboring states, many of whom had children who'd been treated using our protocol. Elena Martinez, now 10 years old and thriving, would be there with her mother. So would dozens of other children whose healing journeys had been improved by the work we'd done. Planning the preview event required careful attention to emotional as well as logistical detail. Many of the families attending had experienced significant trauma, and I wanted to ensure that their first impression of the center was one of hope and possibility rather than anxiety about medical procedure. Working with the hospital's child life specialists, We designed interactive stations where children could learn about the science behind their treatments, see demonstrations of new technologies, and meet the researchers and doctors who would be working in the facility. There would be art therapy activities, music therapy demonstrations, and spaces for families to share their stories with each other. As the opening date approached, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me to this moment. The scared 7-year-old who'd survived a house fire could never have imagined that her experience would eventually help thousands of other children heal more quickly and completely. The ashamed teenager who'd hidden her scars under long sleeves couldn't have envisioned a future where those same scars would be the foundation for groundbreaking medical research. The transformation hadn't been linear or easy. There had been setbacks, moments of doubt, professional criticism, and personal struggles, but each challenge had ultimately contributed to my growth, forcing me to develop resilience, clarity about my values, and confidence in my ability. 3 days before the center's official opening, I received an unexpected phone call from my mother. We'd been in sporadic contact since the awards ceremony, exchanging occasional texts and holiday greetings, but maintaining emotional distance that felt comfortable for both of us. "I wanted to ask if you'd mind if we came to the opening ceremony," she said, her voice carrying the careful tone she'd adopted in our post-reconciliation conversations. "We've been following the news coverage, and we're so proud of what you've accomplished." The request caught me off guard. The opening ceremony was a professional milestone, and I'd planned to focus entirely on the significance of the center rather than family dynamics, but I also recognized that their desire to attend represented genuine growth in our relationship. "You're welcome to come," I said after a moment's consideration. "Just understand that it's going to be a busy day, and I may not have much time to spend with you." "We understand," she replied. "We just want to be there to support you the way we should have been supporting you all along." The phrase stung slightly, a reminder of years when their support had been notably absent, but I appreciated the acknowledgement and the apparent sincerity behind her words. The preview day for burn survivors arrived with perfect spring weather. Sunny but not too warm, with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of blooming trees from the hospital's landscaped ground. Families began arriving early, many of them nervous, but excited to see the facility that represented hope for improved treatments and outcomes. I spent the morning moving between different activity stations, talking with children and parents about their experiences and listening to their hopes for the future. The conversations were both heartbreaking and inspiring, reminders of why this work mattered beyond academic recognition or professional advancement. One conversation that particularly moved me was with a 12-year-old boy named David, whose arms had been severely burned in a camping accident the previous year. He'd been one of the first patients treated using our personalized protocols, and his healing had progressed remarkably well. "Before I came here, I thought I'd never be able to play sports again," he told me as we stood in one of the physical therapy rooms. "But look at this." He flexed his arms, showing off range of motion that would have been impossible under previous treatment methods. His mother, standing nearby, had tears in her eyes. "Dr. Hoffman, I don't know how to thank you for giving us our son back," she said. "Not just his physical healing but his confidence. He's not afraid to be seen anymore." That phrase, "not afraid to be seen anymore," resonated deeply. It encapsulated what I hoped this center would achieve. Not just better medical outcomes, but better psychological outcomes that would allow children to live full, confident lives, regardless of their scar. The official opening ceremony took place on a Thursday morning, in late May, with nearly 300 attendees gathering in the center's main atrium. The guest list included medical professionals from around the country, representatives from the NIH and other funding organizations, hospital administrators, and local political leaders. I'd been asked to give the keynote address, a responsibility that felt both honored and daunting. This wasn't just about presenting research findings or discussing treatment protocols. It was about articulating a vision for how medical care could be transformed through empathy, innovation, and attention to the whole person, rather than just their injury. As I stood at the podium looking out at the assembled crowd,
I thought about all the speeches I'd given over the past few years, conference presentations, award acceptances, grant proposal defenses. Each one had prepared me for this moment. But this felt different, more personal, more significant, more connected to the core of who I'd become. When I was 7 years old, I was severely burned in a house fire. I began, my voice steady despite the emotion behind the words. The physical healing took months, but the emotional healing took decades. I learned to hide my scars, to be ashamed of my appearance, to see myself as damaged rather than different. I paused, scanning the audience and seeing faces that reflected understanding, compassion, and professional respect. My family was there, sitting in the third row, looking proud, but also slightly overwhelmed by the magnitude of what I'd built. This center represents a different vision of healing, I continued, one that recognizes that true recovery involves not just repairing tissue, but restoring confidence, not just treating injuries, but nurturing the whole child, not just applying medical interventions, but providing hope. I talked about the research that had led to this moment, the collaborations that had made it possible, and the children who had inspired every breakthrough along the way. I spoke about Elena Martinez, who was sitting in the front row, with a huge smile on her face, and David, who had regained not just function but confidence in his ability. The children who will be treated in this facility won't have to spend years learning to see their scars as sources of strength rather than shame. They'll grow up knowing that their worth isn't determined by their appearance, that their potential isn't limited by their injuries, and that their communities support their healing in every way possible. As I concluded my remarks, I felt a sense of completion that went beyond professional achievement. This center wasn't just the culmination of my research, it was the fulfillment of a promise I'd made to my younger self, that her pain would eventually serve a purpose larger than her own healing. The applause was warm and sustained, but what moved me most were the faces in the audience. Medical professionals who understood the significance of what we'd built, families who saw hope for their own children's future, colleagues who recognized the intersection of personal experience and scientific innovation that had made this work possible. After the ceremony, there was a reception in the center's family lounge, a space designed to feel more like a comfortable living room than a hospital waiting area. I moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations and discussing research collaborations, but also listening to stories from families about their own experiences with burn injuries and recovery. My family approached me toward the end of the reception, looking both proud and slightly out of place among the medical professionals and researchers who made up most of the attendees. "That was an incredible speech," Ivy said, her voice filled with genuine admiration. "I'm so proud to be your sister." The word proud coming from her felt different than it had in the past. This wasn't pride in my achievements as a reflection of family success. It was pride in who I'd become as a person, recognition of the journey I'd traveled, and the work I was doing. "Thank you for being here," I said, and I meant it. Despite our complicated history, despite the years of hurt and misunderstanding, I was glad they had witnessed this moment, not because I needed their approval, but because I wanted them to understand what I'd built from the foundation of my own pain. Later that evening, after the last guests had left, and the center had returned to quiet preparation for its first patients, I walked through the empty hallways one more time. The equipment was in place, the staff was trained, and the protocols were ready. Tomorrow we would begin treating children whose lives would be changed by the work we'd done. I stopped in one of the treatment rooms, looking out the window at the Denver skyline glowing in the evening light. This room would soon be filled with children beginning their own healing journeys, supported by medical advances that had grown directly from my own experience with trauma and recovery. The scars on my arm pulled slightly as I stretched, a sensation that had once made me self-conscious, but now served as a reminder of how far I'd traveled. These marks on my skin had become the foundation for work that was helping children around the world heal more quickly and completely than had ever been possible before. I thought about the girl I'd been afraid, ashamed, convinced that her differences made her less worthy of love and respect. She couldn't have imagined the woman I'd become, confident, accomplished, using her experience to help others rather than hiding from it. But I also thought about the journey itself, the gradual process of transformation that had brought me to this point. It hadn't been about overcoming my scars or transcending my past. It had been about integrating those experiences into something larger and more meaningful. My phone buzzed with a text from Priya, who was following the opening coverage from Portland, watching the news coverage of today's ceremony. "You looked so confident and beautiful up there. That little girl who was afraid to show her arms would be amazed to see who you became." I smiled, remembering conversations we'd had years earlier, when I was still struggling to accept my appearance and believe in my potential. Priya had seen something in me that I couldn't see in myself, and her friendship had been crucial in helping me develop the confidence to pursue my dream. But now that confidence was self-sustaining, built on years of evidence that my work mattered, that my perspective was valuable, and that my contributions were making a genuine difference in the world. I no longer needed external validation to know my worth, though I still appreciated recognition from people whose opinions I value. As I prepared to leave the center for the evening, I stopped at the plaque by the main entrance that would be unveiled the next morning, when the first patients arrived, the Hoffman Center for Regenerative Medicine, where healing begins with hope. The words captured everything I'd learned about recovery, both physical and emotional. Healing required more than medical intervention. It required the belief that better outcomes were possible, that pain could be transformed into purpose, and that what made us different could also make us strong. 3 months later, the center was operating at full capacity, treating children from across the region, and contributing data to research studies that were advancing the field internationally. I'd been invited to establish similar centers in other cities, to consult with medical schools about incorporating patient perspective into research training, and to serve on advisory boards for organizations focused on trauma recovery. But the recognition that meant the most to me came from the children themselves: letters and drawings from patients, updates about their progress, photos of them participating in activities they'd thought might be impossible. Each communication was a reminder that the work we were doing had meaning beyond professional achievement. One letter that particularly touched me came from Elena Martinez, now 11 years old and preparing to start middle school. She'd written about her plans to study science, inspired by learning about the research that had helped her heal. "Dear Dr. Hoffman," she wrote in careful cursive, "thank you for showing me that scars can be beautiful when they help other people. I want to be a scientist like you when I grow up. Maybe I can help kids too." Reading her letter, I realized that the cycle was continuing, that children who'd been helped by our work were now inspired to help others, that trauma was being transformed into motivation for the next generation of healers and research. Standing in my office that evening, looking out at the mountains that had provided a backdrop for my entire journey, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the path that had brought me here. The house fire that had seemed like pure tragedy when I was 7, had become the foundation for work that was helping thousands of children heal more quickly and complete. The family that had made me feel ashamed of my differences had inadvertently motivated me to prove that those differences could be sources of strength. The community that had watched me grow up quietly was now celebrating my achievements and supporting work that reflected our shared values of compassion and innovation. But perhaps most importantly, I'd learned that healing, both physical and emotional, was possible in ways I'd never imagined. The scared, ashamed girl I'd been was still part of me, but she no longer defined me. Instead, she informed my empathy, motivated my work, and reminded me daily of why this research mattered. The transformation was complete, but the work was ongoing. There were more children to help, more breakthroughs to achieve, more ways to turn pain into purpose, and for the first time in my life, I felt completely prepared for whatever challenges and opportunities lay ahead. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.